Where to begin? My goodness. I especially love the gay snuff porn sequence at the beginning of the story, and the way in which it was portrayed felt so real and necessary for the story to progress. The ordeal is on the other side of Dagliash and the terror that unfolded there. They are out of strength to consume, yet the effects of the strength meat have not worn off. Proteus realizes that he must do something to prevent the ordeal from annihilating itself. If no target is provided, then one will be found. Proteus provided direction for the ordeal's worst tendencies and set them on the sick and the wounded, led by Seebolwol. The latter walked across the corpse-ridden river at the end of the great ordeal, and this was their purpose. An excellent choice on the part of Bakker was portraying the sequence from the perspective of Proteus and the ordeal, only to suddenly flip to Sorwheel and Serwa to provide an outside perspective. I swear, this is one of my favorite writing techniques, where you make the reader think something is so natural and inevitable, to the extent that you can, right? And then smother them with the brutal reality through the simple act of head-hopping. The scene where Proteus is cannibalizing Seebolwol is particularly heavy. Should I eat him? Why not? There are no outs. There are no simple ways to clean the slate. Even as the effect of the meat wears off, the men of the ordeal are still plagued with the memories of what they had done. And this is a problem in its own right. The ordeal's success is threatened by a lack of morale, as the men are convinced that they are damned in the effort of achieving salvation. Proteus tells them it is necessary in order to make it to Golgotha, and he is right, but this is hardly a comfort. In comes one of the more brutal plot twists in the story. Kell'S returns from his trek to Momem, and his recovery of Esmenet and Kelmomus, and he looks upon the ordeal in the aftermath of this terror. And he blames Proteus. He accuses his exalt general of working for the consult, and gives his army a scapegoat for all the guilty memories of atrocity that would have killed their fighting spirit. The following experience caps all of this off. No, if I were strong, you need only command me. I would have committed any atrocity in your name. A rueful breath. That is the universal vanity of men, is it not? To presume they can know all their decisions, past and future? No, old friend. I see more of you than you can fathom. You would have balked, assumed that I had been testing you somehow. If you did not question me, if you assumed me good, then you would have questioned my command. This is why I tore down your conviction. To be uncertain is to embrace the expedient. By trammeling your faith, I assure that you always reached for the nearer club, that you always found for hunger when you cast your sticks. Golgotha, even so distant, it nevertheless managed to loom, to stir some kernel of primeval alarm. Then, why denounce me? The beloved face did not flinch. Because your life is worth the lives of millions. I loved how careful and deliberate Bakker and Kell'S was with these decisions. I remember thinking to myself that I wasn't entirely clear on why Bakker chose to use Proteus in this way, but when this exchange happened, everything seemed to fall into place. The idea that people who are uncertain are more likely to do the easy and terrible thing is just such an interesting point about human motivation. I feel like it'll stick with me for my own writing projects. It's extremely subtle analyses like this that make Bakker's portrayal of Kell'S so compelling. As I am sure I have mentioned before, Kell'S is not just compelling as a concept, he is also well executed. It is so easy to fall into the trope of cartoonish manipulation, where the smart character has no real explanation or plan, but is effectively a supernatural force that wins because of how the story is written. I know that, that essentially describes Kell'S, but again, it's one of those things where you just have to experience it. It's not like something you can just describe. The betrayal of Proteus was also one of the few things that made me feel the horror of the moment. I'm not an emotionless reader, but I tend to indulge in excitement from a more abstract level. I got excited when the Red Wedding happened, even though I liked Robb Stark just fine. I could recognize the potential and excellence of the story, and that always overrides any emotional connection I have to this or that character. The Proteus betrayal was not so different. But even still, I was left floored by the sheer coldness of this development. This was such a profound cruelty that even I felt something beyond the mere adrenaline rush of reading another ballsy plot development. Another thing that occurred to me at this point in the story is how Bakker managed to get away with writing cold-blooded betrayal like this. Social groups tend to break down eventually if there isn't enough social trust, And you often read stories where the villains fail precisely because of this. I could say more on this, but for the sake of time, I simply want to point out that Bakker managed to portray the betrayal of Proyas and Sabin both in ways that avoided the inevitable problems of social trust devolving. Partly is the fact that people don't know that the betrayals by Kell'S have happened, but also because of the other more important things on people's minds, the memories of their actions under the influence of the meat. Before moving on, it is worth mentioning that I like the way Kell'S intentions upon abandoning the ordeal were tied as much to the simple need to leave the ordeal as they were to the need to acquire Esmenet. I wonder why he would leave the ordeal just for Esmenet. He apparently doesn't know. But you eventually grasp that he was just filling his time. His absence was the main point, not the quick trip south. Now it's a time to talk about one of the more negative parts in the story. The White Luck Warrior simply created tension in the story. And that tension is one positive, so I guess I can start this section by talking about that. I like the tense scene during the last whelming where Chucky sees that Sorwheel is about to kill Kell'S, even as the latter is utterly oblivious. The scene is actually kind of strange in that the scene itself was well written, with the surrounding context making it problematic. Bakker expertly brings Sorwheel into the situation, emphasizes Kell'S vulnerability, and pushes the progression of the scene to such an extent that you feel Sorwheel might succeed, in the context of the scene. On the other side, I knew nothing was going to happen just by thinking about the story on a higher level. Obviously, Kell'S is not going to die at this point in the story. But there are other broader implications too. Chucky's immunity to the tricks of the gods is reinforced in the scene, and the aftermath with Kell'S still not grasping what is going on is ominous in its own way. And the context of the ending pays off this new kind of tension in the most catastrophic and profound way you can imagine. So I can recognize that this is not all bad. However, the impression I get from this climactic scene is that Bakker just haphazardly axed what was otherwise an important storyline from the story before the real stuff could start happening. And the implications regarding Chucky, which were kind of redundant, were just shoehorned in later on to make the scene seem like it had to happen. Was the point of the White Luck Warrior literally only to hint at Chucky's immunity to the gods by failing twice? Is that it? I imagine the White Luck Warrior would show up in the final conflict. I imagine there might be important plot developments, and perhaps he might even be responsible for Kell'S failure. Most importantly, I hope there would be thematic or metaphysical developments tied to the culmination of this plotline. But do we get any of that? I wondered why an entire book was named after something that was so peripheral, and now I wonder why it was ever included at all. Like the Moment plotline, surrounding Satma specifically, especially. Beef it up, or cut it. The execution of the White Luck Warrior's reintroduction was also a problem for me. I did not like how Sorwheel kind of just became the White Luck Warrior one day. Maybe I missed something, I'll readily admit that, but I can't help but compare Sorwheel's transformation to the inclusion of the first warrior. The first had this Bakker-esque introduction where this wretched old woman has sex with a man while on her period. Who cares whether that makes sense? And my takeaway was that this is what led to him gaining those divine abilities, right? What is Sorwheel's transformation to this? What was the point of that original scene if someone can just wake up one day with the needed abilities? And I've mentioned this before, but I still cannot appreciate the way Bakker writes the warrior's passages. They make no sense. And I get, he's trying to communicate just how, deterministic it is, how they're aware of their place within the timeline all at once. But this is the equivalent of Moby Dick trying to communicate the tedious nature of sailing on a boat by actually being tedious. You can probably do that in a way that is more creative. I don't know. Before moving on to the important parts of the story, I want to touch upon an assortment of things that in a story that are worth bringing up. The first has to do with the Empire. The beginning of the book is quite clear that my previous assumptions were wrong about the Empire's role after Kell'S returned. I'd assumed that the Empire was going to be saved and that it would play a role in the future of the story in a much more direct manner. At least in the sense that it would have been part of Kell'S plan. But that was immediately put to rest when Kell'S left the Empire behind and told Esmenet that he only returned to acquire her. Kell'S suggestion that he was acting on some impulse he did not understand was questionable, but I also immediately grasped the implication, right? It reminded me of Kell'S full-blooded son in The Great Ordeal, and how he had realized that he was also driven by inexplicable impulses. The suggestion seems to be clear. Dunyan do not seem to have escaped the trap of determinism. Even they seem to have a nature. And it was at this point I started to wonder what Kell'S was up to. It is worth asking why Kell'S is trying to stop the apocalypse at all. Indeed, I remember, from a discussion of the Thousandfold Thought, a very interesting suggestion regarding Kell'S motivations when he killed his father. A commenter had argued that Kell'S knew his father would switch sides to the Consult because he would determine that to be the best way to master his situation. Close off the world from the outside. This has some sense to it, but it immediately made me wonder why Kell'S was not doing the same thing. Why would Kell'S seek to stop his father rather than join the Consult as well? Kell'S motivations are an important thing to question. Bakker, up to this point in the story, has simply taken for granted that he wants to stop the apocalypse. But why when the gods are the way they are? Unfortunately, I didn't speculate about this too deeply, as this was only at the periphery of my thinking, but the ending pays this off in a perfect manner. I will talk about the specifics in the section on the final confrontation. Another quick mention would be when Mimara points out that Natzera, who had essentially gotten Inra killed, had been right all along. The goal had been to uncover the Consult, and Inra had agreed to the risk even. And this revelation is precisely what followed. Yet it had never crossed Akka's mind that Natzera had been in the right. He had always despised the man for what he did. I appreciated this exchange because it both shows the imperfection of Akka and the powerful implications of there being differing perspectives. It was a passing moment, but still a cool little nugget for Bakker to throw into the story. While I'm on the topic of Akka, I think it's also worth mentioning that we still don't understand the source of Akka's dreams. There were some revelations. Some of the scenes basically laid the groundwork for the reveal that Nakayuti was the original no-god, and that the line of the prisoners being herded like cattle was part of the desperate effort to revive the no-god. But there wasn't that much more laid out for us. Akka never learns what the dreams were about, it's simply implicit for the reader, and so Akka never really does anything as a result of the dreams. They seem to have existed for world building alone. Further, there are no hints as to who the source of the dreams is. I speculated that it was Kell'S who had sent the dreams, but that seems less obvious, if not outright false at this point. Finally, I think I am still vague on what Kell'S was planning when he helped Akka get to Ishwal. We still don't know what this really was all about. It's also important to note that Akka's dreams were bound up in this scheme as well, and I have no idea what this is all about if Kell'S is not the source of the dreams. This is part of the reason I am not satisfied with this being the end of Bakker's story. I can appreciate the ending of the Aspect Emperor and of the Unholy Consult, but there is so much background information that needs filled in that I think the No God series is an absolute must. Tangentially related is how Kell'S and Akka contrast in this series. The former has elaborate plans that are enormous in implication and yet are so well thought out. That Kell'S knew he would have the ordeal eat the Srank, that he planned for their descent, that he planned to abandon the ordeal and have Proyas take over, and then finally planned to use Proyas as a scapegoat, is stunningly meticulous, but it also seems plausible when you think about what Kell'S would know from the outset. In contrast, Akka has little to no plan whatsoever. Sure, he works out some things in advance, he organizes the Slog of Slogs, and leads a daring excursion into the Srank-infested north, where he believes he will get the information on the location of Ishwal, yet we are repeatedly reminded throughout the story that Akka basically has no idea what he's doing. That a map turns up in the Library of Soglish is a strange coincidence that is more ominous than anything. He has no plan for engaging with the Dunyan when he gets to Ishwal. He doesn't reevaluate what he's doing when he learns that Lord Kusoter is a lackey of Kell'S. And then his last-ditch effort to make something of the Slog of Slogs is to bring Mimara up to gaze upon Kell'S with her judging eye. This was never the plan. It's just his fallback. On top of that, it's worth asking, then what? What will the judging eye say, and then what is Akka gonna do then? Convince people? This is never specified. Akka's inane trek across Irwa literally leads nowhere because Mimara never actually sees Kell'S with the judging eye. Perhaps the implication is that it would not show damnation, as Ajokli could very well be in charge, but maybe not. And why the hell didn't Bakker have Mimara look at Kell'S and see his soul was saved? The reader's expectation is that Kell'S would be as damned as any, so to have it develop like this would be world-shattering and make us question what the hell the implications were. I don't think the readers would have guessed the ultimate twist if this had been thrown in as the final conflict finally took off. And I think the final moments, when Mimara sees the no-god behind the hologram of Kell'S, would actually be improved with this background knowledge thrown in. I'll admit this kind of transformed into a complaint. My original intent was to compare Kell'S and Akka over their plans or the lack thereof. My thinking was that this was on purpose. I'm not sure that I grasped the point, but the contrast seems to be glaring. Perhaps the point is the irony where Akka might survive and maybe even save the day while Kell'S seems to have failed. At the same time, Kell'S is dead but not done, so maybe Kell'S hasn't failed, at least not yet. Something that I talked about in The Great Ordeal was the manner in which the Ark had fallen. The book suggested that the Ark fell in a way that violated humanity's understanding of causality. The effect of the Ark crashing into the Earth had preceded the actual Ark. I was rather taken with this, speculating about the possibility of an interesting metaphysical twist later in the story. The explanation was provided in the Unholy Consult. It turns out the Ark had a high-tech mechanism called an inertial inversion field, which was utilized when the Ark fell. While Bakker is obviously vague about this, I think the implication is obvious. This field disrupted the fall of the Ark and slowed it down upon impact, with the effect of blowing out the ground before the Ark hit. This created the illusion of violating causality as the field's effect preceded the Ark's arrival. The explanation makes sense and is the simple and easy one. Perhaps I am somewhat disappointed that Bakker didn't use this to truly fuck with our understanding of reality, but that was a rather bold expectation anyhow, and I guess this frees me up with my own writing. At least I know I won't be outright stealing some of his ideas. For these last 2 points, I'm going to switch to talk about the story's metaphysics generally, as well as touch upon interesting philosophical debates this series heavily addresses. In the first appendix of the Unholy Consult, Bakker provides an account of the metaphysics of the world of Irwa. Notably, it is suggested that the stars are embedded in a sphere that is a fixed distance from the Earth. This accounts for why the stars do not move relative to one another depending on where in the globe you are standing. If the stars were suspended in faraway void, this would lead to a parallax effect, which I just described. The quote-unquote outside that is regularly referred to is beyond the sphere containing the stars. I don't think Bakker's point is that this is actually how the world works, however. This argument against stars sitting suspended in void is not necessarily refuted by pointing to a lack of a parallax effect. We know this because people made the exact same argument about our own world. We don't see a parallax effect for our stars. The catch was that the stars were so far away that the effect was negligible. My thinking is that Agensis is in a similar position. He is making the best argument he can with the evidence he has at hand, and that has led him to the wrong conclusion. Which is why seeking more evidence is always a good idea. Lastly, for the assorted musings section, I want to talk about free will versus determinism. Namely, I want to talk about my thinking on the debate and how I think most people aren't really approaching the issue in a correct manner. I have no doubt that this is going to be very controversial, so perhaps you'll just think I'm babbling a bunch of horseshit, but that's how philosophy works, right? The primary issue, as with basically every debate, is definitional. People simply take for granted what free will actually means, and its meaning is generally implicit in how terms are juxtaposed with one another. I will start by outlining 2 possible definitions for free will, the differences of which could have profound implications. And I'm not suggesting that these definitions are jointly exhaustive of all the options. That may be the case, but I do not know that. First definition. Free will is when one's will is an uncaused cause. Definition 2. Free will is when one has control over one's actions. There are a few clarifications to make. The first definition is what the free will versus determinism dichotomy assumes. By juxtaposing free will with determinism, free will has to be a violation of what determinism describes. And determinism simply suggests that all things are determined via causal relationships. If one's will is uncaused, then it cannot be determined by any causal relationship. The second definition, however, is not exactly at odds with determinism at all. Theoretically, one can have control over their actions while still understanding that all their behavior is determined by causal relationships with prior events. Additionally, this definition is one that seems relevant to the question of personal responsibility. Are you in control of yourself, or are you not? And it also highlights that these two ideas are separate, even though they are often conflated with one another. I think I will start by providing an example that will highlight the difference and make it more concrete. Here are two scenarios. Suppose you are physically forced to leave a room, and this is to such an extent that you are picked up and forced out. The second scenario is similar. You still leave the room, but this time around you choose to leave the room. Presumably, there is a distinction between these two scenarios. In one scenario, you have no free will in that circumstance, and in the second, you do. And in one scenario, you have responsibility, but not in the other. But it is only the second definition that seems to capture this fact. This is because you are not in control in the first scenario, but in the second, you are. If you use the first definition, though, the difference between the two scenarios is not necessarily captured. You could posit that the second scenario is completely determined, and conclude that there is no free will in that scenario either. But if neither scenario exhibits free will, then what is the distinction between the two? Presumably they are different. Our intuitive understanding of responsibility is distinguished by the comparison. But if free will is not what accounts for it, then what does? This thought experiment is meant to show that the second definition makes more sense when trying to account for responsibility for one's actions. And the reason people think that free will is so important, and the reason people are so loath to part with it, is because of responsibility and its role in morality. Morality seems impossible if no one has free will, and therefore no responsibility for their actions. Further, by distinguishing the two definitions, I am also arguing that the question of whether our behavior is determined is not actually relevant to whether we have free will. I think people might still balk at this. There is this very powerful belief that people hold that if our behavior is determined, especially since these prior causes are outside of us, it implies that we do not have control over our actions. I reject this assumption, however, and I will present another example to explain why I think it is wrong. Ultimately, the fallacy is failing to understand the implications of being part of this world. We understand that hormones influence behavior to a large degree. Testosterone, for example, exacerbates status-seeking behaviors in people. If you have higher levels of testosterone in your bloodstream, this takes an existing behavior, status-seeking, and makes the tendency to behave in that way greater. Hormones do not necessarily determine the behavior, but they do play a role in determining it. This is part of the reason why men predominate positions of power and why patriarchy is so relevant in the first place. If the majority of people seeking to rule are men, then it allows them to create institutions that often explicitly exclude women or use them in other ways. Patriarchal societies can obviously be mediated, today, for example, but it still involves working against certain tendencies. Now, let's suppose that we are talking about an individual man's actions. He is a controlling bastard. He always has to be on top, and this is accounted for by his high levels of testosterone. Suppose someone claims that, he isn't responsible for his behavior. He didn't choose to be controlling. The testosterone is simply making him that way. This claim reflects the position that I intend to refute. Namely, it conflates the two definitions of free will by assuming that testosterone is an outside cause, though not necessarily a determinant of our behavior. This is false. Testosterone is not outside of us. It does not make sense to say that testosterone led the man to be controlling, as opposed to him choosing to be controlling. The man's choices were made because of his higher levels of testosterone. Testosterone is part of the causal story for why the choices were made in the first place. It is not an alternative to him making choices. This is because testosterone is part of what makes up the man in the first place. The man is the testosterone in a sense. Or put in a more nuanced manner, the testosterone is just one part of the whole that is the man. This is the implication of being part of this world. Once you try to understand who we are, we break down into component parts just like anything else. The emergent whole that is you is not some separate entity or metaphysically distinct entity. What this means is that a hormonal explanation does not actually imply that you are not in control of your actions. The man is in control of his actions. His testosterone is simply part of the causal story for how his control over his actions manifests in the first place. We are part of this world, and this means whatever control we have over our actions will manifest deterministically. In conclusion, when asking ourselves whether we have free will and are therefore in control and responsible for our actions, we should use the second definition. We should not be asking whether our behavior is determined. We should be asking whether we have control over our actions. This is taken with the knowledge that determinism does not undermine our control, but simply explains it. This does not mean that there aren't complications over what it means to have control over one's actions. The basic idea would be that we are an entity that exists as a whole, and which makes choices in response to outside influences. Some examples are obvious. Being physically cast out of the room is an obvious example of not being in control. Others are less so. If a man puts a gun to your head and you choose to leave on pain of death, you are making a choice, but are you really in control? Is that a fair choice? That's another way of putting it. How is this lack of control accounted for? What if the man takes something you value and casts it without the room, leading you to chase after it? What if the man lies to you, leading you to leave the room? So yes, these are all legitimate questions, as much of the decisions we make in life are made in the context of incentives like these. Even the gun example, the government. I'm not claiming to have all the answers, especially not here right now, and this section has expanded long enough anyway. What matters is that free will can exist even as behavior is determined, because free will is the question of whether or not you have control over your actions. The reason this discussion of free will matters is that I'm not sure how I'm supposed to interpret a lot of the discussions of free will in this series. I can't assume that Bakker has my view of free will. Indeed, it seems that he's an eliminative materialist, which means that he denies that mental states exist at all, or at least that our conventional views of the mind are wrong. This probably means that he denies the existence of a will altogether, thus rendering the question of whether said will is free or not to be irrelevant. Unless he is suggesting the existence of a will by showing that even the Dunyin are driven by things they don't understand. It's very uncertain, and to be fair, he talks about uncertainty as if that's very important to his series, and yes, it is. So maybe he's uncertain about free will in and of itself. Even still, the implication of someone like Kell'S influencing people's behaviors is a terrifying prospect. It suggests that behavior is almost wholly determined, and even by my definition, it seriously questions whether people have control over their actions. At what point does Kell'S have control over somebody? The fact that Kell'S can have such profound influence alone has discomforting implications.